How's it feel to be back on roadie?
It's
Can you answer that?
like we just already said, it's a
Yeah.
lot of fun and it's very electric and everybody should come and see us.
Yeah, okay.
There was a time when everything looked perfect on the surface, when the music of Fleetwood Mac filled arenas across America, and every performance felt like history in the making. And at the center of it all stood Stevie Nicks, a voice that audiences trusted, a presence that felt timeless, and a figure who seemed completely in control of her world. But what the audience never saw was how many people were pulling that world in different directions at the same time. Because behind the success, behind the songs, and behind the image, Stevie Nicks was not moving through a stable career. She was moving through a series of confrontations, one after another, with men who did not see her the same way she saw, to herself. Men who tried to shape her, challenge her, control her, or stand directly in her way, and each of those moments left a mark that would not disappear. These were not quiet disagreements, and they were not misunderstandings that faded over time. These were direct conflicts happening in studios, on tours, and inside relationships that could not hold together under pressure. And the more successful Stevie Nicks became, the more intense those confrontations grew, because success did not remove the tension around her. It attracted more of it. 5 men. 5 different moments. 5 conflicts that changed the direction of Stevie Nicks's life and career in ways the audience never fully understood. And once those moments began, they did not stop. They built on each other, escalating from professional tension to personal breakdown, until what looked like a legendary career from the outside was actually something far more unstable. Underneath, something shaped not just by music, but by confrontation, after confrontation that forced Stevie Nicks to fight to remain who she was. Because this was never just a story about success. It was a story about what happens when one person is surrounded by people who all want something different from her and refuse to back down. Stevie Nicks was born on the 26th of May, 1948 in Phoenix, Arizona, and from the beginning, her path into music was not built through structure or discipline in the traditional sense, but through persistence and a very specific kind of creative instinct that did not easily adapt to outside control. And that became clear early, long before the world knew her name. By the time Stevie Nicks entered Fleetwood Mac, she was not arriving as someone willing to be shaped by others. She arrived with a defined identity, a writing style, and a voice that already carried its own direction. And that was exactly where the first problems began, because the environment she stepped into was not built for independence. It was built on strong personalities, competing ideas, and constant pressure to deliver results. What made Stevie Nicks different was not just her sound. It was her refusal to adjust that sound under pressure, and that refusal placed her directly in conflict with the people around her, especially the men who were used to leading, controlling, or directing the creative process. And instead of adapting to that system, Stevie Nicks pushed against it, creating situations where compromise became difficult and confrontation became unavoidable. And as her career began to rise, those confrontations did not disappear. They multiplied, because the more successful Stevie Nicks became, the more people stepped in with expectations, demands, and influence, and instead of finding stability, she found herself moving from one conflict to the next, each one more direct than the last, each one forcing a decision, and each one leaving a permanent impact on what came after. Number 5. Jimmy Iovine. When Stevie Nicks stepped into the studio with Jimmy Iovine, the working relationship did not begin with hesitation. It began with control, because Jimmy Iovine immediately took charge of the sessions, stopping takes mid-recording, calling out changes without discussion, and setting a pace that left little room for negotiation. And from the first sessions, it was clear that Jimmy Iovine was not there to follow Stevie Nicks's direction. He expected Stevie Nicks to follow his. The tension became visible during recording when Stevie Nicks delivered vocals the way she always had, raw, instinctive, and emotionally driven, and Jimmy Iovine cut her off, asking for a different tone, a different phrasing, a different approach. And when Stevie Nicks pushed back, Jimmy Iovine did not step aside. Instead, Jimmy Iovine repeated the demand, forcing Stevie Nicks to either adjust or stop the session. turning what should have been a recording process into a direct confrontation over control. What escalated the situation was that the conflict did not stay inside the music because Jimmy Iovine carried that same authority outside the studio, making decisions, setting expectations, and speaking as if he had the final say over the direction Stevie Nicks should take. And that created repeated clashes where Stevie Nicks had to challenge Jimmy Iovine directly, refusing changes, rejecting direction, and forcing conversations that quickly became tense and personal. At one point, sessions slowed down not because of technical issues, but because neither side was willing to give in with Jimmy Iovine insisting on precision and structure, and Stevie Nicks refusing to reshape her identity to meet those demands. And that standoff created a pattern where every new session carried the expectation of another conflict, another disagreement, another moment where the music stopped and the argument took over. And in the end, the working relationship between Stevie Nicks and Jimmy Iovine did not collapse quietly. It broke under the weight of repeated confrontations, because Jimmy Iovine would not release control, and Stevie Nicks would not accept it, leaving behind a result that made one thing clear, that this was never just a collaboration. It was a conflict over who had the authority to define what Stevie Nicks would become. Number 4. Joe Walsh. When Stevie Nicks became involved with Joe Walsh, the relationship did not unfold quietly. It moved fast, surrounded by touring late nights and an environment where boundaries were rarely respected, and from the beginning Joe Walsh brought a lifestyle that did not slow down for anyone, including Stevie Nicks. The conflict became visible during time spent on the road, where Joe Walsh continued a pattern of heavy substance use, unpredictable schedules, and a level of chaos that directly affected those around him, and Stevie Nicks was not removed from it. She was inside it, dealing with missed commitments, disrupted plans, and moments where work and personal life collided in ways that made stability impossible. At one point, plans that involved both music and appearances began to fall apart because Joe Walsh did not follow through, arriving late, canceling without warning, or showing up in a state that made work difficult, and those situations forced Stevie Nicks into direct confrontation, where she challenged Joe Walsh over reliability, over priorities, and over whether the relationship could continue under those conditions. Joe Walsh did not adjust, and that became the center of the conflict because while Stevie Nicks attempted to maintain structure around her work, Joe Walsh continued moving in the opposite direction, keeping the same habits, the same pace, and the same disregard for limits, creating repeated clashes where Stevie Nicks had to either accept the instability or push back against it. The breaking point came when it became clear that the situation was not changing, that no conversation, no argument, and no expectation would alter the way Joe Walsh operated, and at that moment, Stevie Nicks made a decision that ended the relationship not through a gradual drift, but through a direct refusal to continue, under conditions that could not be controlled, leaving behind a conflict that was defined not by one argument, but by a pattern that never stopped. Number 3. Don Henley. When Stevie Nicks became involved with Don Henley, the relationship quickly moved into a space where control and expectation began to dominate every interaction, because Don Henley did not approach the relationship passively. He questioned decisions, challenged direction, and inserted himself into conversations about both personal choices and professional moves, creating immediate friction. The tension became clear during discussions about music and timing, where Don Henley expected structure, clarity, and long-term planning, while Stevie Nicks continued to move based on instinct and momentum, and those differences led to repeated confrontations where Don Henley pushed for answers, pushed for commitment, and pushed for decisions that Stevie Nicks was not willing to make under pressure. At one point, the conflict escalated during a disagreement over direction and priorities, where Don Henley challenged Stevie Nicks, directly questioning not just her decisions but her consistency, and Stevie Nicks responded without backing down, rejecting the pressure and refusing to align with expectations that felt imposed rather than shared, turning the situation into a direct standoff where neither side moved. What made the situation more volatile was that the relationship carried consequences beyond the moment, because the tension between Stevie Nicks and Don Henley did not end when conversations stopped. It carried into the music, into public perception, and into a pattern where interactions were followed by reactions, statements were followed by responses, and the conflict extended beyond private arguments into something that had visible impact. In the end, the relationship between Stevie Nicks and Don Henley did not settle into compromise. It ended through accumulation, through repeated confrontations that never reached agreement, and through a final understanding that neither side was willing to adjust enough to make the situation work, leaving behind a conflict defined by pressure resistance and a refusal on both sides to give control to the other. Number 2. Mick Fleetwood. When Stevie Nicks crossed a personal line with Mick Fleetwood, the situation did not stay private because Mick Fleetwood was not just another relationship. Mick Fleetwood was part of Fleetwood Mac, and that meant every decision carried consequences inside the band itself. The conflict became immediate when the relationship began affecting rehearsals and internal dynamics, as tension between Stevie Nicks and Mick Fleetwood started to surface during working sessions, where communication shifted, focus broke down, and interactions that should have been professional became strained, forcing other members to notice that something inside the structure of the band had changed. At one point, rehearsals became difficult to maintain not because of the music, but because of the atmosphere, as conversations between Stevie Nicks and Mick Fleetwood turned direct and tense with disagreements happening in front of others, creating a situation where personal issues were no longer separate from the band's operation, and decisions about performances, scheduling, and collaboration began to carry the weight of that conflict. What escalated the situation further was the impact on trust, because once the relationship shifted, it affected how Mick Fleetwood managed the band and how Stevie Nicks responded to that authority, creating repeated clashes where Stevie Nicks challenged decisions and Mick Fleetwood pushed back to maintain control, turning leadership into confrontation rather than coordination. The breaking point came when it became clear that the relationship could not exist without destabilizing the group, and at that stage the conflict was no longer just between Stevie Nicks and Mick Fleetwood, it was affecting the entire operation of Fleetwood Mac, forcing a separation that was not gradual but necessary, because continuing would have risked breaking the band itself. Number 1. Lindsey Buckingham. From the moment Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham entered Fleetwood Mac together, the connection between Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham was already carrying tension. But unlike every other conflict, this one did not develop later. It was there from the start, and it followed them into every part of their work. Inside the studio, Lindsey Buckingham controlled the recording process, with precision stopping takes, demanding changes and pushing for a level of perfection that left little space for deviation. And Stevie Nicks did not accept that control without resistance, leading to repeated confrontations where Stevie Nicks challenged Lindsey Buckingham directly over decisions, delivery, and authority, turning recording sessions into arguments that interrupted the work itself. On stage, the conflict did not disappear. It became more visible because Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham were required to perform side by side, singing songs that reflected their past while standing in a present that was no longer aligned. And during performances, distance, timing, and interaction became points of tension where even small moments carried meaning, creating an atmosphere that extended beyond the music. At one point, communication between Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham broke down to the point where discussions turned into direct confrontations without resolution, with Lindsey Buckingham pushing harder to maintain control over the sound and direction, and Stevie Nicks pushing back to maintain independence, creating a cycle where neither side adjusted, and every session, every rehearsal, and every performance carried the expectation of another clash. What made this conflict different from all the others was that it never fully ended because, unlike every other relationship that could be separated from the work, Lindsey Buckingham remained inside the same band, inside the same songs, and inside the same space as Stevie Nicks, forcing both of them to continue operating within a structure where the conflict could not be removed, only managed. And in the end, the situation between Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham was not resolved through agreement or compromise. It remained defined by repeated confrontation, by control versus resistance, and by the fact that neither Stevie Nicks nor Lindsey Buckingham ever stepped back enough to fully remove the tension, leaving behind a conflict that became part of the music itself and part of everything that followed. In the end, nothing about this story returns to normal. The stage is still there, the music is still there, and the name Stevie Nicks is still connected to the legacy of Fleetwood Mac, but everything that built that legacy came through conflict, not stability, through confrontation, not agreement, and through a series of moments that never fully settled. Because it did not begin with one problem, and it did not end with one solution. It moved from Jimmy Iovine inside the studio, where control became the issue, to Joe Walsh on the road, where instability took over, to Don Henley, where pressure and expectation created direct confrontation, to Mick Fleetwood, where personal decisions affected an entire band, and finally to Lindsey Buckingham, where the conflict never fully disappeared. Each one was different. Each one forced a decision, and none of them ended cleanly. What remains is not a single story, but a pattern, where every step forward came with resistance, and every success carried something unresolved behind it, creating a career that was not shaped by smooth progression, but by repeated confrontation that never fully stopped. And that is why, even now, when people look back at the music, the performances, and the legacy, what they are really seeing is not just a career, but the result of everything that happened around it. Every argument, every refusal, every moment, where someone tried to take control and was met with resistance. Because in the end, this was never just about music. It was about what happens when one person refuses to be defined by anyone else, even when everyone around them tries.